Hello and welcome to Lesson 5 of Software Design and Development for Higher Computing. Today we're going to look at records and arrays of records. You've already done parallel 1D arrays. That's what you do at National 5 level, where you've got an array of one type of data and another array of another type of data, and the data is kind of linked, like you could have an array of names and a related array of their ages. Something like that. Let's create a new replit and let's call it records1. We might do another one. Now, a record is just a data structure. There are different types of data structures. One is a variable, which just contains some data, whether it's text like this, meaning it's a string, or whether it's an integer, or even a float. That's a variable. Next, you've got an array. Now, technically, Python doesn't have an array, but instead uses a thing called a list. But because the SQA specifies that you need to know about arrays, we're going to treat this as if it was an array. Now, it's very similar to arrays anyway, but it's just a list of different pieces of data in a single variable name. So here's an array of 4 items. Now, another data type that you need to know about at higher level is called a record. Unfortunately, just like arrays, Python doesn't have a record structure. So we have to use something that's similar to it. Now, all a record is, it's kind of like a variable, but it can contain multiple pieces of information, but it's different to an array because all the pieces of information relate to a single thing. Now, that might not make any sense to you just hearing those words, so let me show you an example. Now, let's say we have one human called John, and John has an age, he's 35, and he studies computing science, and he got 93% in his last exam. He also studies maths, but he only got 62% in his last exam. But English is his worst. He only got 22% in his last exam. Now, all of these are separate variables, but they're all related to one person. And what we could have 5 separate arrays that contain the same data on multiple people. That would be parallel arrays. Well, what a record can do is bundle all of these pieces of data into a single data structure. And when we pass that data structure around between functions and procedures, all of the data goes with it. So it's a single data structure that can contain multiple pieces of data all relating to a single object, in this case, a human. Now, obviously, this is a bad way of doing it, so we're going to use what's called a class. Now, classes are normally used for object-oriented programming. We're not going to use it for that. We're going to use it as a record structure for multiple reasons. Number one, it's quite similar to a record structure anyway. Number two, we can use it in exactly the same way we would use record structures, and the SQA have given exam questions that use a similar structure. And thirdly, it's a good way to segue into advanced higher because you will do object-oriented programming at advanced higher. So when learning records at higher, you may as well learn through classes because it's going to help you when it comes to advanced higher. Right, so how do you create a class? Well, as you can see, we've got the class keyword. And after the keyword, we give this record a name. I'm going to call them records, even though technically it's a class. So human was what I called it earlier. So let's just call it human. You could call it person. That might be a bit better. Then you do a colon, you press enter, and then we're in the class structure now. It's indented. When you create a record structure or when you create a class, you need a subprogram within it it's technically called the constructor. And you type out def, then double underscore, then init, which stands for initialize, then double underscore again, and then open and close bracket. But in these brackets, you need to type self. Then colon, then enter. Now, all of this would make far more sense if you were studying advanced higher and you were learning about object-oriented programming using classes. But because this is just higher computing, I don't want to bombard you with too much information about what all this means. So just trust me for now, this is how you create a record structure. Now, after the init function or the init subprogram, what you need to do is list all of the pieces of data that this record is going to store. And you need to do self dot and then the name of the thing that you're storing. So I had a name and then we give it a default value. So I'm just going to leave it as blank as default. We're also going to store this person's age and let's just set the default as 0. We'll do the same for their computing grade and we'll do the same for maths and English. So this is a blank, this is kind of like a template. It's like a blank page. It's like an empty template that we can use repeatedly, but fill in the blanks for each time we want to store something new. So how do we use this record structure? Well, we need to create a variable that's going to store a record. So let's just call this P1, which is short for person1. And like any variable, it doesn't matter what we call it as long as we refer to this whenever we want to refer to that person. Then we use this record structure by typing person and then open and close brackets. So what this does is it creates a blank person and stores it in the P1 variable. Next, what we can do is we can say p1.name. So I'm using the dot notation here, and I'm going to use dot notation to set a new name. Because at the moment, well, let's try this. If I say print p1.name, what it's going to do is print an empty string. There we go, it printed an empty string. So if I change this to default name, it's going to print p1's default name, which is default name. But if after I've created person 1, p1, I change their name to John, when I print p1's name, it's going to print John. So there we go. So as you can see, the default name, I'm leaving it as blank just so I know what data type it is, and so that I'm not putting in something that if I forget to change it later, that it comes up a bit odd. I'd rather someone had no name than had the name default name. Personal preference. So I can give this person a name, I can say their age, and likewise their computing grades. I can't remember the grades that I set earlier, but so here I have created a person record. I've stored it in the P1 variable, and I'm setting their name, their age, and all the other attributes, and I'm printing their name. And I can print the other attributes as well. Let's print the age and their computing grade. There we are. So this is how you create a single record, just like this. How do we create an array of records? Well, let's do a quick example using the same structure. So I'm going to leave this structure here, and it's always recommended to leave your classes or your record structures at the very top. I'm going to delete this. This would have been the main program. Let's delete this. And let's create a new function that is get people. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a people array, which stores nothing initially. But then I'm going to loop 5 times. And each time round the loop, I'm going to create a new person using the person record structure that we created earlier. And I'm going to set the new person's .name equal to an input from the user. Enter the new person's name. And I'll do the same for their age, their computing grade, their maths grade, and their English grade, their percentage. New person's age. Remembering that these are integers as well. Okay. Now what do we do? So each time round the loop, I'm looping 5 times, I'm getting a new person, a blank person, and I'm giving them a new name, age, computing, maths, and English grade. Then what I want to do is with this new person, I want to append them to the people array. So people.append the new person. Now each time round the loop, I'm going to create a new person, get their data, and append that new person to the array. Then I loop around again. I then create another new person. So this new person's been appended to the array. I'm going to create a new blank one, get their data, and append that separate person to this array again. And so on and so forth. Then at the end, after I've gotten all the people, I'm going to return the people array. Beautiful. Now let's do something a little different. Let's create a new attribute in our record. Let's call it average. Also starts at 0. In fact, averages can be floats. So let's make this one a float. This is how I recommend setting your default values. And in fact, sometimes in an exam, they might ask you to set the data types. So I'm just going to add a little comment here. And finally, float. Now, it's not completely necessary. I think that just adding a piece of data as a default value, that should be enough. But just in case, if it's an SQA exam, I would recommend adding a little comment to state the data type of each piece of data. So we've added a new attribute, it's called average. So what we can do is, once we get all the people, now you're not going to type in the average grade, you want the program to calculate the average for each person. So what we can do is, we can create a new function called calculate average. And it's going to take in a list of all the people. Now in this function, def get people, I've called the array people. In this function, which is a totally different function, I've called it all people. Now, as I said in the previous lesson, it doesn't matter what you call it, as long as within the function, you are consistent. So I'm going to call it all people in this one. And for every person, I am going to set their average grade. Now, there are a couple of ways we could do this. I'll show you both ways. Let's do it the first way, my preferred way. I like to say for person in all people, person.average equals, and I'm going to do the calculation, divided by 3. And this is all you need to do. Then at the end, we need to return all people. So this is one way of what's called iterating through an array. Now this is an array of records, and when you iterate through something, the control variable in the for loop will contain one of the things inside the array. Now this is true for arrays of records, arrays of names, arrays of numbers, arrays of ages. It's even true for strings. If I iterate through each character in a string, so in my main program, I'm just going to create a string called hello. What I can do is I can say for C in S. Now S is the string, and the string has multiple characters. C is going to contain one of those characters each time around the loop. I could just print C. Now these are terrible variable names, and I don't recommend that. Here we have it. It's just printing one of them at a time. So that's what this is doing in a way. All people is an array of people or person records. So the person variable will contain one of those records once at a time. But I suppose a way that is more common in other programming languages, instead of iterating through the objects within this array, it'd be more common to iterate through the indices, the indexes of this thing. So what you would do instead, for I in range length of all people. And what this does, all people is the array of all the people. So if we've got 7 people, length will give us the number 7. Range 7 will give us a range from 0 to 6, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I will contain one of those numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, once at a time. So instead of person.average, what we need to do is say all people at location I.average. And we need to do that for each of these. Now, functionally, it's exactly the same. There is no difference in the way you do it. The only benefit of this one is that you have the index that you're working with. And that can be beneficial, but personally, I try not to use this if I'm not going to use the array index. So we've got a function that gets all the people. We've got a function that calculates their average grade. Next up, let's create a procedure that displays averages. And we're going to take in all the people. And all we're going to do is for each person in the all people array, just print the person's name plus their string version of the person's average grade. Should be good. Right. Let's create our main program now. So in our main program, we need an array that's going to store all the people, and we're going to get that from the getPeople function. It's going to return all the people. So we're going to ask the getPeople function to return an array of all the people. We're going to store it in this array. Next up, we need to calculate the averages. So we're going to overwrite the people array with a new array that contains the averages, and we get that new array by calculating the averages using the calculate average function. Right, let's just copy and paste this. It's my code, I can copy and paste. Now remember, we're passing in an array of all the people. What array contains all the people in my main program? The people array, not the all people array. Doesn't exist in the main program, all people. Okay, so we've calculated the averages here. Next up, we need to display all the data. What are we displaying? This. All right, let's copy this again. And we've got the same problem, people instead of all people. There we go, fixed it. Let's run it and see what happens. I'm going to pull this back a bit. Enter the new person's name. Right, so we've got John. He's 25. You've got 93, 65, and 22. We've got another new person's name. And this is going to loop 5 times, so let me rattle through this. There we go. So we entered the 5 people's data. The calculate average function calculated everyone's averages. And then the display averages procedure took all the people and displayed their names and average grades. And there it is. Doesn't look very great. It might be better to just print an empty line at in the middle there, so that these appear a little bit separated. Right, so that was a lesson on the record structure. This is how you create the record structure. This is how you create a single record, and you can add data to that record using this, what's called dot notation. Give it a try. See if you can experiment with a program using a record structure. Again, Records technically don't exist in Python. This is a class or an object, but it's the closest thing we have, and it works really well, and it segues nicely to advanced hire for those of you who are ambitious. Either way, have fun, and I'll see you in the next one.